All right, I think I'm recording here, but we'll see. All right, so today we're going to talk about monetary policy. Monetary policy is a lot of times used with fiscal policy in order to help our U.S. economy. Okay, the Federal Reserve is the name of our central bank, and that's what dictates monetary policy. Now, understand that each country has different central banks. All right, I think in Canada it's called the Central Bank of Canada. In Europe, it's called the European Union. All right, they have a bank, their own central bank that has a board of governors and different things like that. And what it does is it uses its tools in order to help stimulate the economy. By law, the Federal Reserve has authority over the banking industry. However, they are nonpartisan. They make their own money, but they are given legal authority in our country to do certain things to help stimulate the economy. A lot of times it's used more efficiently than fiscal policy because fiscal policy is run by politicians who are worried about getting reelected. They don't have to worry about that on the monetary policy side. There's three tools that they use to help stimulate an economy: the reserve ratios, the discount rates, and the open market operations. All right. So these are three things that shift the money supply. And we've talked about this before, but the Fed sets the money supply. All right. They can inject money in three different ways in order to help either slow down or speed up an economy. All right. The first one is the reserve requirement, which we've talked about in our bank balance sheets. The next one is something called the discount rate, not as used as often, but certainly important. And then the third is the thing that's probably used the most, something called open market operations, which is buying and selling of bonds. This guy here is the most important person you've never heard of. His name is Jerome Powell. He is potentially the most powerful man in the world. At any given point in time, the chairman of the Federal Reserve is very important because even the words that he says could move markets in countries across the world. So he's an important guy, and is our leading economist in our country. The reserve requirement we've talked about, so I'll go through this pretty quick. But remember that the bank has to keep a certain amount of your money. So only a small percent of your money is held in reserves. The rest is loaned out. We call this fractional reserve banking. So it's the percent of the deposits that they have to keep. Okay. When the Fed increases the money supply, it increases the amount of money that is held in the bank deposits. And so if they want to increase the money supply, they can lower the reserve ratio, which would then give the banks more excess reserves to loan out. Right? So if there's a recession, what could the Fed do to the reserve requirement? Okay, they could decrease the reserve requirement. And remember, all of this is how it's going to impact aggregate demand. All right, so banks hold less money and have more excess reserves. Banks create more money. This will shift the money supply to the right. That will lower interest rates and force AD up. Okay, if they want to increase the reserve ratio or do some sort of contractionary policy, right? They would hold more money and fewer excess reserves, create less money, which would then decrease aggregate demand by decreasing or interest rates increasing. Okay, so remember how it impacts interest rates, how it impacts aggregate demand. You need to know those steps, right? So increasing the reserve ratio would eventually increase interest rates, which would decrease aggregate demand. All right, the one we haven't really talked about, the discount rate. This is basically just interest rate that the Fed charges commercial banks. So commercial banks need to loan money every once in a while too. They can do that through the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve controls the U.S. Treasury. So if they want a certain amount of money, they can go to the U.S. Treasury and say, print this X amount of money, and they will do it. And so if you want to go and borrow money from the Federal Reserve, they'll have the money for you. And this is how they make their money. They charge those banks interest, and the interest that they make pays all their employees and all their banks and different things like that. Okay. So to increase the money supply, the Fed should decrease the discount rate. Decrease the discount rate. And to decrease the money supply, the Fed should increase the discount rate. Okay. The most commonly used is something called open market operations, and this is just buying and selling of bonds, all right, or government securities. So the Treasury has a certain amount of Treasury securities that they need to fund the government. And they issued these securities to banks. Banks will give them money, and the banks will hold the bonds, but sometimes the banks are going to want some money, so they'll sell the bonds back to the Fed and get some money. And it's a good way to gain a little interest and give out loans essentially to our government. So this is the important and most important and widely used monetary policy. So to increase the money supply, the Fed would buy government securities, and to decrease the money supply, the Fed would sell government securities. And a good way to remember that is buy big. So buying bonds increases the money supply. So it's the expansionary policy. All right. Selling is going to decrease the money supply. This is the contractionary policy. Okay. And the buying and selling, and what they're trying to do is trying to hit a certain target when it comes to interest rates. The federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge one another for one-day loans in reserves. So you probably noticed this in your life, but banks close early. And one of the reasons that they close early is they got to make sure that they have enough money in their required reserves for all of the loans that they've made and all the deposits and withdrawals that have come up through the day. They got to do their books. And if they don't have the money that they need, they have to borrow that money. They can borrow it from the Federal Reserve through the discount rate, or they might be able to do it cheaper by borrowing money from other banks. This is called an overnight loan. This is what the federal fund rate is trying to reach. Banks can dictate and determine their own interest rates, but they can be heavily influenced by how easy money is to get from the Federal Reserve. So the Fed influences them by setting a target rate and using open market operations to hit that target. So there's a Federal Reserve in New York City. It's probably the most important Federal Reserve. In that room is a bunch of computers, and there's a bunch of men and women behind those computers buying and selling bonds to try to hit that rate. And then they look at all the other banks throughout the country, all the commercial banks throughout the country, and try to see what they're charging for overnight loans. And if they see, well, they're charging too high of an interest rate for overnight loans, they'll inject more money into the economy. If they're charging too low, they'll try to take money out of the economy. Okay? So they're constantly buying and selling bonds in order to get that target rate. All right, so the federal fund rate fluctuates due to market conditions, but the monetary policy in the buying and selling of bonds is a big part of that. We can see the federal funds rate through the years. It's been pretty low in current years. We've seen it really high. My parents talk about buying houses in the late 70s and 80s, paying 15% for a mortgage. Right now you can easily get a mortgage under 4%. You could probably even get it pretty close to 3%. And it all really has to do with the federal funds rate that's set, right? Because it will influence all interest rates throughout the economy. So how does this impact aggregate demand, aggregate supply? Remember, there's contractionary policy and there's expansionary policy, both fiscal and monetary. But what you're trying to do is increase or decrease aggregate demand. So here's just a couple graphs that kind of help show this. You have a supply, your money market graph. The investment demand graph isn't something you need to necessarily be able to draw, but it will help for this. And how it influences ASAD is important. So if the Fed increases the money supply, so expansionary policy, interest rates will decrease, investment will increase, and aggregate demand will increase. Okay, so you can see it up there. Supply increases, the quantity demanded of investments will increase, and you have an increase of aggregate demand. All right, so looking at it the other way, if you take money away from the economy, you have an increase in interest rates, which will decrease the quantity of investments, which will decrease aggregate demand. Okay. So why would the Fed ever want to slow down the economy? Well, the answer to all of this, and you're wondering like why would we ever do this, is inflation, right? We worry about inflation because real wages and all those real costs can go down if inflation is too high. So they're trying to take away the punch bowl just as the party gets going. All right. They're kind of the party poopers, and they got to be the party poopers because the fiscal policy people aren't on a week-to-week basis going to do the things that need to get done. All right. So how does it look on a bank balance sheets? Clifford went over this one earlier in one of his videos that I posted, but you can kind of see how much is the required reserves in this situation. Well, it's going to be 10% or $2,000. How much is the excess reserves? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. If the I got to go back. If the Fed buys $1,000, how much is the required reserves? There's no change in the required reserves with the Fed buying that, right? So your treasury bonds will go down. Your excess reserves will go up. So they were at 3,000, they'll now go to 4,000. How much more can the bank initially lend out? Well, you could say total they could lend out 4,000, but initially they can only lend out $1,000 more. What's the maximum change in the money supply? Well, the maximum change from that $1,000 will be multiplied by 10. All right, and I got that because the reserve ratio is 10% or 0.1, and 1 over 0.1 is 10, which is your multiplier. So apply that to the $1,000, you'll get $10,000. So the maximum change in the money supply is $10,000. So the maximum change in demand deposits of all banks is going to be that $10,000. So what they're talking about there is that money is then lent out, that $1,000. Somebody spends all of that money. Wherever they spent it, they'll take that money and deposit it into banks. Okay, a portion of that is held in required reserves, and then the rest is loaned out, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the maximum change in demand deposits will be that full 10,000. All right, the maximum change in required reserves will just be the 10,000, the required reserve ratio of that 10,000, which is 1,000. So that 1,000 will be put back into required reserves, and the 10,000 will be put out. All right, and that's it.